The year was 1882, and the dust of Dodge City swirled around a man who seemed out of place. He was a Christian pastor, new to this wild frontier town, and he stood quietly before the swinging doors of a saloon. The wood of the building looked rough, worn by countless hands and the harsh prairie winds. Just as he was about to move, the doors burst open. Out stepped a man, tall and broad, with a gun belt slung low on his hips, his eyes dark and sharp, fixed on the pastor. Everyone in Dodge City knew this man. He was trouble, a force of nature with a temper that could ignite faster than a match strike. He stopped dead in his tracks, directly in the pastor's path. The armed man, whose name was Silas, let out a short, harsh laugh. It wasn't a friendly sound. His gaze swept over the pastor's plain clothes, then back up to his face, lingering with a sneer. "Well, look what the prairie wind blew in," Silas drawled, his voice rough like gravel. "Another sky pilot, come to tell us about sin and salvation, eh? You think your God's got any business in a place like this, preacher? This ain't no Sunday school picnic. Here, we make our own rules, and your good book don't mean a thing." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground near the pastor's worn boots, a clear sign of disrespect. The challenge hung heavy in the air, a thick tension that made the other few people on the street pause their movements, watching. Silas's eyes narrowed, daring the pastor to flinch, to show fear, to back down. This was how things worked in Dodge City. You either stood your ground or you got run over. But the pastor, instead of recoiling, held his gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger, just a deep, steady calm. A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through them, something unreadable like a deep pool reflecting the sky. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence stretch, letting Silas's words hang there, empty and loud. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a surprising weight. "Silas," the pastor said, his voice even, "this encounter, right here, right now, marks a turning point, not just for me, but for you too. You may not see it yet, but you will." Silas blinked. The unexpected composure, the quiet firmness in the pastor's voice caught him off guard. He was used to defiance or fear or even a desperate plea. This calm declaration was something new. His hand almost instinctively began to drift towards the polished grip of his revolver. It was a habit, a reflex, a threat he used without thinking. But before his fingers could close around the cold metal, the pastor shifted. It was barely a movement, a subtle change in his posture, a slight tilt of his head. Nothing aggressive, nothing overtly threatening, but it was enough. In the pastor's eyes, a silent warning flashed clear as day. It wasn't a challenge to a fight, but a deeper, more profound message that made Silas freeze. He had misjudged this man. This wasn't some weak, easily intimidated preacher. A fleeting sense of unease, a prickle of something he rarely felt, crossed Silas's face. He paused, his hand hovering over his gun, unsure. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Then, without another word, the pastor simply stepped around Silas. He continued his path, walking calmly into the heart of Dodge City, leaving the armed man rooted to the spot. Silas stood there, watching the pastor's retreating back, a silent challenge still lingering in the air between them. The street remained quiet, the dust settling slowly. What this first confrontation truly meant, what it would lead to, was anyone's guess. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The pastor, whose name was Thomas, had grown up in a small, quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. His family was deeply religious, and faith was the bedrock of their lives. Sundays were spent in church, followed by long, thoughtful discussions around the dinner table about scripture and morality. His father, a stern but fair man, was a carpenter, and his mother, gentle and kind, managed their home with quiet efficiency. Their lives were simple, centered on hard work, community, and an unwavering belief in God's plan. Thomas learned early on that honesty, integrity, and compassion were not just ideals, but the very fabric of existence. He was taught to always offer a helping hand, to speak kindly, and to turn the other cheek, even when provoked. From a young age, Thomas showed a remarkable aptitude for learning. He devoured books, spending hours poring over texts, his mind alight with curiosity. His parents, recognizing his intellect and his deep spiritual inclination, encouraged his studies. It wasn't long before he felt a distinct calling, an undeniable pull towards theological studies. He enrolled in a seminary, dedicating years to understanding the complexities of faith the history of the church, and the art of delivering a sermon that could touch hearts and minds. The path was challenging, requiring immense sacrifice and dedication. Long nights were spent in study, early mornings in prayer. He learned to articulate his beliefs, to comfort the grieving, and to inspire hope in the downtrodden. He truly believed in the transformative power of the gospel, seeing it as the ultimate solution to humanity's woes. Thomas was, by nature, an earnest man. His faith was not just a set of rules, but a living, breathing part of him. He carried an almost childlike naivete about the harsh realities of the world, believing that good intentions and a strong moral compass could overcome any obstacle. His dreams were grand yet simple, to bring spiritual guidance, moral order, and a sense of community to those who needed it most. He envisioned himself as a shepherd, gently leading his flock towards a brighter, more virtuous path. He believed that even the most hardened hearts could be softened by love and understanding. This ideal fueled his decision to venture westward, to the frontier towns where civilization was still finding its footing and where he felt his message might be most urgently needed. Dodge City, however, was a far cry from the peaceful Pennsylvania hills. Its reputation preceded it, a whispered legend of lawlessness and vice that echoed across the plains. It was a town born of the cattle drives, a rough and tumble place where fortunes were made and lost in a single night, and where the line between right and wrong often blurred into non-existence. Saloons outnumbered churches, gunfights were not uncommon, and justice was often dispensed by the fastest draw. It was a magnet for gamblers, outlaws, and those seeking to escape their pasts, a raw, untamed corner of America. Silas, the armed man Thomas had encountered, was a prominent figure in this chaotic landscape. He wasn't just a tough guy, he was a force of nature in Dodge City. He owned a piece of the biggest saloon, had a hand in many of the town's less-than-legal dealings, and his word, backed by the glint of his revolver, carried significant weight. He embodied everything Thomas hoped to change: the disregard for law, the embrace of violence, the casual cruelty. Silas represented the very forces Thomas aimed to confront. The darkness he believed could be illuminated by faith. The contrast between Thomas's earnest ideals and Dodge City's brutal reality was stark, setting the stage for a conflict far greater than a simple street confrontation. Thomas had arrived with a heart full of hope, ready to plant the seeds of righteousness in what he saw as barren ground, unaware of just how deeply rooted the weeds of lawlessness truly were. Thomas's first days in Dodge City were a slow, steady chipping away at his hopeful spirit. He arrived with a vision of open hearts and eager listeners, but the reality was a constant series of small, grinding disappointments. His attempts to engage with the townsfolk, to share a kind word or offer assistance, were often met with blank stares, quick dismissals, or a cynical laugh that seemed to echo the very dust of the streets. He'd approach a group of men outside a general store, hoping to introduce himself and his mission, only to have them fall silent, shift uncomfortably, and then disperse, leaving him standing alone. The women, when he encountered them, would often avert their gaze, pulling their children closer as if his mere presence was a threat. He tried to find a suitable building for a church service, speaking to various property owners. Each conversation started with a glimmer of possibility, a nod of understanding, but inevitably ended in a vague promise to look into it that never materialized. One man, a grizzled merchant, listened patiently to Thomas's plans for a community gathering place, a sanctuary from the town's rough edges. He even shook Thomas's hand and said, "Sounds like a fine idea, Pastor. Come back next week." But when Thomas returned, the man merely shrugged, claiming the building was suddenly leased to a new saloon owner. It felt like a deliberate slight, a subtle mockery of his earnest efforts. He experienced veiled insults regarding his faith, too. One evening, as he walked past a saloon, a man inside yelled, "Preacher, why don't you pray for rain? Maybe then we'll believe in your magic." Laughter followed, sharp and cutting. These incidents, though seemingly minor, slowly started to wear down his initial optimism. The constant rejection, the quiet avoidance, the subtle barbs, they built up, forming a wall between him and the people he had come to serve. It wasn't outright violence, but a more insidious form of resistance, a collective apathy that was harder to fight than any fist. Silas, the armed man from their first encounter, became a recurring presence, a shadow that seemed to follow Thomas even when he wasn't physically there. Silas didn't always confront Thomas directly, but his influence was undeniable. Thomas would overhear conversations in the street, whispers about Silas's power, his connections, his disdain for anything that smacked of Eastern piety. Sometimes Silas would just be there, leaning against a post across the street, watching Thomas with a smirk. He never said anything, but his presence was a constant, unsettling reminder of the forces arrayed against the pastor. The taunts from Silas weren't always direct words. They came through the actions of others, the way people would suddenly change their minds about helping Thomas after a brief conversation with Silas, or the way a group of men would laugh a little too loudly when Thomas walked by, their eyes flicking towards Silas for approval. It was a subtle manipulation, a demonstration of power that highlighted Thomas's perceived weakness. Once, Thomas tried to gather some children for a Bible story session. He had managed to get a few curious youngsters together, but then Silas walked by, made a casual comment to one of the boys about how boring church was, and within minutes, the children had scattered, leaving Thomas alone with his open Bible. Each broken promise, each subtle humiliation, each cynical glance, set against the backdrop of Dodge City's rugged culture, contributed to Thomas's growing emotional burden. The initial confrontation with Silas now felt less like an isolated incident and more like the opening salvo in a longer, more draining war. Thomas had come to bring light, but the darkness of Dodge City and the pervasive shadow of men like Silas seemed far more entrenched than he had ever imagined. He was starting to feel the weight of his mission, a heavy, sinking feeling that chipped away at his once unshakable resolve. He understood that the initial defiance he showed Silas was just a moment, and the real fight was a daily grind against indifference and entrenched vice. The atmosphere in Dodge City around Pastor Thomas became thick with increasing hostility. It was no longer just indifference, it was active opposition. His sermons, once met with quiet scorn, now faced open scoffing from the back rows of the temporary meeting hall. Men would deliberately turn their backs, light cigars, and make loud comments about the futility of his words. Women, who had initially shown some polite interest, now hurried past him on the street, avoiding eye contact as if his presence itself was contagious. His attempts at charity, simple acts like offering food to the hungry or mending torn clothes for the poor, were often sabotaged. Supplies he had purchased would mysteriously disappear, or the recipients of his aid would be seen later with new, expensive items, clearly bought with money given to them by Silas's men, a mocking gesture that undermined Thomas's efforts. His presence was actively shunned by a growing segment of the population, those who either feared Silas or simply found more comfort in the town's established vices. Silas, emboldened by Thomas's apparent lack of retaliation, began to escalate his provocations. He seemed to relish the pastor's quiet suffering. He orchestrated public displays of disrespect, making sure Thomas was always within earshot or eyesight. One afternoon, as Thomas walked past the saloon, Silas had a group of men stage a mock sermon, with one of them dressed crudely in an exaggerated black coat, mimicking Thomas's earnest gestures and quoting scripture in a drunken, slurred voice. The laughter that erupted was loud and cruel, and Thomas could feel the heat rising in his face, but he forced himself to walk on, his jaw clenched tight. Silas also spread rumors, insidious whispers that questioned Thomas's motives, his past, even his sanity. He actively worked to turn the townspeople against the pastor, framing him as an outsider trying to impose unwanted rules on their free way of life. Thomas faced immense social pressure. It was a suffocating kind of isolation. Neighbors who once offered a nod now averted their gaze. Local merchants who initially sold him goods on credit suddenly demanded cash up front, citing vague business difficulties or changes in policy. Even those few individuals who had initially shown some kindness, perhaps a sympathetic glance or a hushed word of encouragement, began to distance themselves. They feared Silas's wrath, knowing that any association with the pastor could bring trouble to their own doorsteps. Thomas found himself eating alone, walking alone, and praying alone. The silence of his small rented room felt heavier each night, filled with the echoes of unspoken judgments and the phantom presence of those who had turned away. He experienced a profound emotional suffocation, a feeling that no matter where he went or what he did, he was being watched, judged, and found wanting. This period was Thomas's lowest emotional point. He grappled with his faith and his mission, the very foundations of his being. He questioned his ability to make a difference in such a hardened place. Was he truly called to this, or had he mistaken youthful idealism for divine purpose? He felt the weight of judgment from all sides, from the townspeople, from Silas, and even in his darkest moments, from himself. He wondered if he was failing God, if his efforts were not enough, if his quiet endurance was simply cowardice. He prayed, but his prayers felt hollow, bouncing off the ceiling of his room rather than reaching heaven. He reread his Bible, searching for answers, for strength, for any sign that he wasn't completely lost. The once clear path of his calling had become muddled, obscured by the dust and despair of Dodge City. He felt like a lone figure standing against an overwhelming tide, slowly being pushed back, inch by painful inch. This internal struggle, this profound doubt, was a critical shift, just before something was about to give. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with a hushed knock on his door late one evening. Thomas, lost in the dim light of his lamp, looked up to see a figure cloaked in shadows, a woman he recognized as Lily, one of the saloon girls. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the usual anxieties of her life. She looked around nervously before stepping inside, pulling the door shut behind her. Her voice was barely a whisper as she began to speak, revealing a heinous act committed by Silas. It wasn't just a rumor or a taunt. It was a grave injustice, a cruelty against an innocent that was both morally reprehensible and legally actionable. Lily, her hands trembling, told Thomas about a young man, barely more than a boy, who had come to Dodge City with dreams of working on a ranch. He had a small amount of money, saved from years of hard labor back east, and a naive trust in people. Silas, seeing an easy mark, had befriended him, promising him a job and a place to stay. But instead, he had systematically cheated the boy out of his savings. Then, when the boy tried to stand up for himself, Silas had beaten him badly and left him for dead on the outskirts of town. Lily had found the boy, nursed him back to health in secret, and helped him escape Dodge City before Silas could finish the job. She had kept silent until now, terrified of Silas's reach, but the memory of the boy's terrified eyes and broken spirit had finally become too much for her to bear. She had come to Thomas because she sensed, despite all the town's talk, that he was the only one who might actually care, the only one who might do something. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of Silas as a petty bully with this monstrous act. The details Lily provided were stark, painting a picture of calculated malice. He was torn between his spiritual calling of forgiveness and the undeniable need for justice. Forgiveness, he had always believed, was paramount. But how could he forgive such an act without condoning it? How could he preach redemption when such evil went unpunished? The cruelty was not just against one person. It was a wound inflicted upon the very fabric of humanity, a blatant disregard for life and dignity. This revelation forced him to confront the limits of his pacifist approach. He had tried to turn the other cheek, to endure the slights, to pray for his enemies. But passive endurance had only emboldened Silas. It had allowed evil to fester, to grow, to claim more victims. He realized then that his quiet suffering had been misinterpreted as weakness, not strength. His reluctance to engage had been seen as an invitation for further aggression. The town's silence, born of fear, had become a breeding ground for Silas's depravity. In that moment, Thomas made a profound decision. He would no longer passively absorb Silas's abuse. He would no longer stand by while such injustices occurred. He resolved to use the information Lily had given him, not for vengeance, but to bring about a reckoning. He would expose Silas's true nature, not just to the town, but to whatever semblance of law and order existed in Dodge City. This decision marked a complete narrative pivot for him. The gentle, enduring pastor was still there, but now he was infused with a steely resolve, a righteous anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. He would seek justice, not just for the boy, but for every person Silas had intimidated, cheated, or hurt. This moment shattered the cycle of suffering and humiliation that had defined his time in Dodge City. The weight lifted, replaced by a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt since his early days of ministry. The fear that had gnawed at him for weeks began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard determination. He, Thomas, the quiet pastor, was now armed with critical information and a renewed sense of purpose. He looked at Lily, his eyes reflecting a new light. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice firm. "You did the right thing. Now, we need to make sure something is done about it." He prepared to act, knowing that his actions would change everything, not just for him, but for Dodge City itself. The pastor, Thomas, felt a whirlwind of emotions after Lily's confession. Anger flared, hot and sharp, at the sheer injustice of Silas's actions. A cold dread also gripped him, a fear of what Silas would do if he found out Thomas was challenging him. But beneath it all, a fierce determination began to solidify. He held a terrible secret, a truth that could either destroy Silas or get Thomas himself killed. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavy and constant, but it also sharpened his focus. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not let this go. His first cautious step was to approach Sheriff Brody. Brody was a weary man, his face etched with the years of trying to keep some semblance of order in a town that fought against it every day. Thomas found him in his small, dusty office, cleaning his revolver with slow, deliberate movements. Brody listened, his eyes unblinking as Thomas recounted Lily's story, leaving out no detail of Silas's cruelty. When Thomas finished, the only sound in the room was the soft click of the revolver's cylinder. Brody sighed, a long, tired sound. "Silas is a snake, Pastor. Everyone knows it. But he's a snake with fangs and a lot of friends who don't ask questions." He paused, looking at the pastor with a gaze that seemed to weigh his resolve. "You're talking about stirring up a hornet's nest, a very big, very angry hornet's nest. What you're asking for, Pastor, could get you killed, and anyone who stands with you." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "And letting him continue, Sheriff, will kill more than just bodies. It will kill the soul of this town." Brody grunted, but a flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through his eyes. He didn't promise immediate action, but he didn't dismiss Thomas either. He said he would look into it, which, in Dodge City, was often as good as a promise of intervention. Next, Thomas sought out a few other quiet members of the community he had come to trust. There was Mrs. Henderson, a stern but kind widow who ran the general store, and Mr. Davies, the blacksmith, a man of few words but strong principles. Both listened with somber faces. Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands, worried about the trouble Thomas was inviting. Mr. Davies simply nodded, his eyes hard. He had seen enough of Silas's justice. Their support was cautious, a quiet agreement to watch and, if necessary, to speak up. It wasn't a full army, but it was a beginning. The cultural dynamics of Dodge City meant that open opposition to someone like Silas was dangerous, and true justice often relied on individual courage rather than a robust legal system. The psychological toll of his decision was immense. Sleep became a luxury he rarely enjoyed. His mind constantly replayed Lily's words, turning over every possible outcome. He pictured Silas's face contorted in rage and felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He was a man of God, not a fighter in the physical sense, but this was a fight he couldn't avoid. He spent hours in prayer, not for safety but for strength, for clarity, for the courage to see this through. The initial fear slowly began to transmute into a steely resolve, a quiet burning in his chest that pushed him forward. He understood the danger, the very real possibility of retaliation, but the alternative, allowing Silas to continue his reign of terror, was far worse. Silas, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to the shift in the pastor. He continued his usual arrogant behavior, swaggering through town, his eyes surveying his domain with unchallenged authority. He still made his dismissive remarks about Thomas, sometimes even in Thomas's presence, confident that the pastor was a harmless, easily intimidated fool. He had no idea that the quiet pastor, whom he had so thoroughly underestimated, was now a coiled spring, ready to release a truth that would shake Dodge City to its core. His downfall had been set in motion by his own cruelty, and he was too blind to see it coming. The day of the confrontation arrived, not with gunshots, but with words spoken in the dusty halls of the newly established courthouse. Pastor Thomas, his face calm but his eyes unwavering, stood before a small assembly that included Sheriff Brody, a nervous circuit judge, and a handful of townsfolk who had dared to show up. Silas, flanked by a few of his usual associates, swaggered in late, a sneer on his face, clearly expecting another one of the pastor's tiresome sermons. He even chuckled loudly when he saw Thomas at the front. But this was no sermon. Thomas began to speak, his voice clear and steady, detailing the injustices, the intimidation, and finally, Lily's testimony. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, not with anger, but with a quiet, undeniable authority. He spoke of the specific act of cruelty, the details Lily had provided, details that only someone directly involved would know. Sheriff Brody, looking grim, corroborated parts of the account, having done his own quiet investigation since their last meeting. He hadn't found a smoking gun, but enough circumstantial evidence, combined with Lily's brave statement, to make Silas's position shaky. Silas, initially dismissive, slowly started to lose his composure. His sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear and then a cold fury. He tried to interrupt, to deny, to threaten, but the judge, a man who had seen too much of Dodge City's lawlessness, held firm. The weight of the pastor's words, backed by the sheriff's quiet nods and the judge's serious demeanor, began to turn the tide. The townsfolk in attendance, once fearful of Silas, now looked at him with a mix of shock and dawning realization. His reputation as an untouchable figure, built on fear and intimidation, began to crumble right there in that small, stuffy room. The legal proceedings were slow, as justice often was in the frontier, but the public exposure was immediate and devastating. Silas was formally charged. His usual allies, seeing the shift in power and the potential for their own involvement, began to distance themselves. Some even quietly offered their own smaller testimonies against him, now that the fear of retaliation was lessened. Silas, stripped of his power and influence, faced a choice: stand trial and likely face imprisonment, or leave Dodge City. He chose the latter, fleeing under the cover of night, his reign of terror effectively over. His departure was a quiet whimper, not the roar he had always projected. With Silas gone, a tangible shift occurred in Dodge City. The air felt lighter. The tension that had hung heavy over the town for so long began to dissipate. The pastor, now seen not as a naive outsider, but as a man of profound courage and conviction, gained the respect he had initially been denied. His church, once sparsely attended, began to fill. People came, not just for spiritual guidance, but for a sense of community, a place where justice had prevailed and hope could once again take root. Thomas, however, knew this was just the beginning. He started initiatives to help those Silas had exploited, particularly women like Lily, offering them support and a chance at a new life. He worked with Sheriff Brody to establish clearer lines of law and order, advocating for a more just system. He preached about forgiveness, yes, but also about accountability, about standing up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. He often reflected on his journey. Dodge City had been a harsh teacher, stripping away his initial naivete and forcing him to confront the complexities of faith in a world that often seemed godless. He learned that faith wasn't just about prayer and scripture. It was about action, about courage, about fighting for justice when no one else would. The lessons were etched deep within him, reminding him that true strength lay not in avoiding conflict, but in facing it with integrity. His actions left a lasting legacy. Dodge City, still a frontier town, began its slow transformation. It wasn't an overnight miracle, but a steady, persistent effort towards becoming a place where decency could thrive. The pastor, no longer just a man of God, but a pillar of the community, continued his mission, forever proving that even in the most challenging environments, moral courage, when coupled with unwavering resolve, could indeed prevail and bring about hopeful change.